Okay, so in addition to the summary that obviously you're reading in Lesson 5, I thought it would be helpful to go through exactly what they mean when they're showing you how to manipulate those equations to show how to represent those situations in various ways. So the first part of the equation, the first equation that they show you, that they start with, is d equals 10t. And they show you how to manipulate it, but I want to make sure that you understand that we're not just manipulating it, but we're using those rules that we've been using right along. What's the opposite? So what I'm referencing here is the fact that we have a number next to a variable, which you should know by now means to multiply, and then we ask ourselves what's the opposite. In this particular case, it's of multiplying by 10. Make sure it looks like 10. Opposite of multiplying by 10. And you should by now know that the opposite of multiplying by 10 is dividing by 10. And we would do that on both sides of the equation. Now, when we've done this before, there's been a number on the other side, so we're actually doing some type of division. In this case, it remains a variable. So what we're doing is, still crossing this out, and we're left with d divided by 10 equals t. And we also remember that dividing by 10 is the same as multiplying by 1/10. So we could also say that 1/10 d is equal to t. So these, all three of these actually mean the same thing. We've just represented them in different ways. The next example that they move on to actually doesn't have any numbers at all. It has that k, which we know is the constant of proportionality. So we start out with y equals kx. And this is an equation that you should be getting yourself very, very familiar with. We're going to be seeing it a lot, especially once we get into writing, solving equations, those units. We are obviously already doing those things, but not just solely that. We're using them to apply to these tables and proportional relationships. So in the same way that we did the previous one, we know we're going to be asking the question, what's the opposite? I know this may look strange because there's no numbers here, only variables, but it's the same process. So in this side right here, we've got, instead of a number and a variable, two variables. Two variables together means they're being multiplied. And we're saying what's the opposite of multiplying? And in this case, it's by a variable k. It's the opposite of multiplying by k. So we should know the opposite of multiplying is always division. And in this case, we're dividing by k. So if I've got two of the same, usually we're looking at numbers like 2 divided by 2 or 2 over 2, which would be equal to 1. But it's the same process or the same thing when we've got two variables. They cancel each other out. So we're left with y divided by k equals x. Again, these mean the same thing. Now, just like we did on the previous problem when there was a number, we know that dividing by k is the same as multiplying by 1 over k. So 1 over k times y is equal to x. So we've got three different things here, 1, 2, and 3, that all mean the same exact thing. So it is also important that we understand that we can do this in the opposite way. So in other words, and this is not, on that summary page, but it's important that you still understand Suppose we had, we started out with y divided by 5 equals x. So in this case, we still ask the same question. And hopefully by now you should know what it is. What is the opposite? What's the opposite? Now, in this case, we're not multiplying, but what's happening here? Division. So what's the opposite of dividing by 5? You should know the opposite of dividing by 5 is multiplying by 5. So I'm going to say times 5 and times 5. Now, why did I write it like that? Well, this is just like seeing a fraction, 5 over 1, times y over 5. And I should know that those two 5's cancel, just like they did before. So on this side, I'm left with y equals x times 5. Well, we don't know what x is, so technically it's the same. But remember, the proper way to write that is always the variable first, the number first, followed by the variable. Sorry, I said that backwards, but I wrote it correctly. So y equals 5x is the exact same thing as our original y divided by 5 equals x. So again, we've got these two, and they are exactly the same. And just to, send it home again to make sure that you really understand, suppose we are given that x equals y divided by k. We do the same thing. Actually, let's even back that up again. Suppose we're given x equals 1 over ky. So hopefully you know that these mean the same thing. So if you were given this 1 over ky, you would know to change it so that you could manipulate it. And more than likely, you're not going to be called upon to manipulate these yourself very often. However, you should understand how they relate to each other. So if I go to this problem right here, and it's always the same, what's the opposite? In this case, what's the opposite of divide by k? Well, hopefully, I'm going to give myself more room here, so I'm going to move it. X equals y divided by k. Hopefully you know the opposite of division is multiplication, so times k and times k. So if I carry on the way I usually do, this has to go over 1. Those two will cancel. On this side, I'm left with y, and on this side, I'm left with kx. And you should know, an equation is equation. Both sides are equal, so I can just reverse these. Y equals kx, and they mean the same thing. Again. That's a funny arrow. Anyway, so again, all the same.